Audio Jungle.
Hi everyone. In this video, we are going to talk about the differences between infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. So basically, IaaS and PaaS are two different cloud offerings. So people mostly prefer IaaS and PaaS based on their application requirements. So in this video, we are going to focus on what are the differences between these two different cloud offerings. But before we talk about the cloud offerings, we need to first understand how these things works in the on-prem, right? And then we can talk about the cloud offerings, how they are solving the problem. So think about the fact that if you want to deploy a particular application, and in case of on-prem, in a world without cloud, how do you do that? How do you deploy an application into your servers, right? So let's talk about that first. So so in case of on-prem, in a world without cloud, actually you have to take care of this entire stack. Your responsibility is to build this entire stack. Say if you want to deploy a typical Node.js application into the servers, let's see what are the things we have to do. So the first thing in on-prem is you have to set up the hardware. So you have to purchase the required number of hardware racks and with the certain number of CPU and RAM. And then you need to find a certain server room. You configure all the hardware devices into it and properly connect an uninterrupted power supply or something like that. So you need to make sure you have a proper hardware in place, and then you also have to configure the networking for those hardwares. So maybe you have to set up the routers, switches, and you need to connect all these hardware devices to each other using some bunch of wires or something, so that these devices can talk to each other. So you have to make sure the networking is in place. And also virtualization. So you also have to install a proper virtualization software on top of all those hardware devices so that you can create some VMs out of it. So actually in one of the other video, I talk about the virtualization in detail. So I would highly recommend you to watch that video. So basically, when we deploy a Node.js application, we are not going to deploy that application directly into the hardware, right? That's not what we are going to do. So basically, we are going to enable the virtualization on top of the hardware, and then we are going to create VMs out of it, and you deploy your application into those VMs. Now, when you create the VMs, now you have to install some operating system into it, right? So either you might prefer some Windows server-based operating system or Linux-based operating system. So you install certain operating system into those VMs. And then on top of the operating system, now you need to install certain runtime. Say if you want to deploy the Node.js application, then probably you want to run Node runtime in those machines. Or if you want to run your application as a Docker container, then you need to run Docker engine in those machines. So now once you have a proper runtime in those machines, now you can build your software and deploy your application into those machines. So in case of on-prem, you are actually responsible for this entire stack of things that you have to do, right? But in case of cloud, let's see how things are different in the cloud. So one of the primary advantage of cloud is the cloud manages the difficult part of this particular stack. I mean, managing the hardware. So that's one of the difficult part, right? You have to invest a lot of money in purchasing all those hardware devices, and you need to set it up properly. So the cloud actually takes care of managing the difficult part in this stack, which is managing your hardware and configuring the networking on top of that. Now, in case of infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, that thing is actually common, which is the cloud will take care of your hardware stuff. You don't have to worry about any of the hardware configuration. So now in case of the infrastructure, if you see, cloud takes care of the hardware, configuring the networking, and also it takes care of the configuring the virtualization on top of that. Now all you have to worry about is you go to the cloud, you create certain number of VMs, and you install certain operating system into those VMs, and also you install certain runtime. In our case, if it is a Node.js application, you might be installing the Node runtime or a Docker engine if you want to run a Docker container. And then you build the software and deploy your application in it. So in case of IaaS, infrastructure as a service, you are just managing the infrastructure and you are not managing the underlying hardware. The cloud will take care of the underlying hardware. So you just have to create the necessary infrastructure components for your application, and then you build your application and deploy into those servers. Now, in case of a platform as a service, as I already told you, cloud will take care of managing the hardware, and it also takes care of your networking and managing the virtualization. But in addition to managing the hardware, in case of PaaS, the cloud will also manage the underlying infrastructure. So unlike infrastructure as a service, you don't have to create any VMs. So you don't have to create VMs, you don't have to configure how much CPU or RAM you needed for those VMs, and you don't get the opportunity to install the necessary operating system into those VMs and also the runtime. So you just have to tell the cloud that I want this application, I'm building this application, I just want to run this application in the cloud. And the cloud will take care of running the application in the cloud and abstract all the underlying infrastructure and the hardware details from you. So basically, the cloud actually offering you a platform where you can run your application without worrying about the underlying infrastructure and the underlying hardware. So basically, people prefer infrastructure as a service in case if they want to have a complete control over the infrastructure. Say if I want to have a complete control, like I want to choose the number of VMs. Say I need 5 VMs for my application, so I should be able to choose the number of VMs for my application, and also I should be able to choose how much CPU and how much RAM I want in each VM. So that level of detail I should be able to control in the infrastructure. And also I should be able to see what operating system I want to install and which runtime version I want to install. So I will have a complete control over the infrastructure. And then on top of that, I will build the software and deploy the application. So there are some good examples for the infrastructure as a service, like Google Compute Engine is one of the good example, and AWS EC2 instances are good example for IaaS, and Azure VMs are also good example of infrastructure as a service. So yeah, people prefer IaaS if they want to have a good control over the infrastructure. And people prefer the platform as a service in case if they don't want to have good control over the infrastructure, or if they don't have the capability to manage the infrastructure in their team. So in such cases, team would prefer the platform as a service. So there is no need for you to manage any underlying infrastructure or hardware. All you have to worry about is build the software and give the artifacts to the cloud. Like the artifact could be a Docker image if you want to run it as a Docker container, or you could just zip your application source code and give it to the cloud, and the cloud will take care of running your application in the cloud. Now, there are some good examples for platform as a service, like Google App Engine is one of the platform from GCP. AWS Elastic Beanstalk is a good example. Or Azure Container Instance is also a good example for platform as a service, where you are just giving you the artifacts to the cloud, and the cloud will take care of running your application. You don't have to worry about the underlying components. So in this video, we actually talked about the differences between the infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, and in which scenarios people would prefer which one. And I also gave some of the links in the video description to read more about these concepts. I hope this video is useful for you. Thanks a lot for watching.
Audio Jungle.